In this video, we're going to use Nectar 3 to get that pro sound with our SM7B. We're going to take the sound from something like this, these ideas, even though you think of them, to something like this, these ideas, even though you think of them as, and we're actually going to do even better than that because we're going to actually clean the audio. So first up, you of course need the Shure SM7B. And the Shure SM7B requires a minimum of 60 dB of gain. So you'll need an audio interface that has at least 60 dB of gain for your mic preamps. Now I'm using a PreSonus Studio 1824C, which has 65 dB of gain for our mic preamps, but I'm also using a separate preamp. In this case, I'm using a cloud lifter, which gives me another 20 to 25 dB of gain. So you're probably going to need some sort of a cloud lifter, FET head, or other style of preamp in order to get your levels up. Because if you try to record the SM7B with a standard, like a USB style audio interface, a lot of them only have gain that goes up to about 40 to maybe 50 dB, and you're going to get a really, really weak level. So make sure you get those levels up. There will be links in the description for all of the gear that I use. So let's go ahead and head in here now and get working on this. Let's go ahead and bypass Nectar 3. Now, before we get to Nectar 3, we're going to clean up our audio. And here's our audio file that we have already recorded. And I've already used this audio file in a different video that shows you how to get that Joe Rogan podcast sound. What I'm going to show you in this video is the settings that I prefer. So if you want those Joe Rogan settings, go watch that video. Then come back to this one here and see how they differ. So for our audio file right here, it's already recorded with pretty good levels. Just play back here. These ideas. So pretty good level. You think of them. Now you might need to jack it up a bit with clip gain or whatever you use in your DAW. I'm going to give that about another 1.7 dB. You could try normalizing, but we don't really need to pull those levels, all the way up. This is pretty good here, as long as we're not clipping. Even though you think of them as. So the first thing we're going to do, and you may or may not have to do this, is we're going to use a plugin called RX Mouth Declick. This is from iZotope. And this gets rid of those mouth noises, something like noises like that, which can be annoying. Now, if your audio doesn't have that in it, of course, ignore this, but you can use this as well. So right now we have this on an insert. Now understand in Pro Tools, we could also use the audio suite version and then just select the portion of audio that may have those, mouth clicks in there and then render that to just those areas. Okay. But you could also use it right on an insert. So let's listen here. Ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe. So right here's a little bit creating it. You may or may not hear that. Put on some quality headphones if you can't hear this. Okay. So just this area is creating it. Is creating it. Hear that? So with this on, it's pretty easy to use. Just choose your sensitivity. Are the clicks lower or higher in frequency, and are we getting them right here? So we can widen that up or pull it down. Essentially, it's pretty easy to use. You really just have to mess around with it. So if we just hear this now with it on, maybe your brain is creating it, but those clicks are gone. So bypass it. Maybe your brain is creating it. Right here, man. It's awful. Creating it. Hear that? Creating it. So again, on, creating it. Create. All repaired, as you can see right there, 17 clicks repaired. Okay, so you could just have this on your track if you want. Always right click and commit that if you want. Or again, my preference is really to use the audio suite version and only affect the areas that I want to affect. So right now we're going to leave it off because we don't really have that much mouth noise in here. It's creating it. A little bit annoying, but we'll be okay. Now, what is annoying to me is some of that background noise. Now, I was in a room with a computer running when I recorded this track right here. So there's a little bit of background noise in that. Let me go ahead and turn on Nectar 3 just for the compression so we can really, pull those levels up. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. You hear that? So if we go to an area like this, hear all that background noise? Okay. So we're going to use a plugin called RX Voice Denoise to get rid of that. Basically, all you need to do is whenever you open it up, it's going to be set on about 12 and 0. It will be in adaptive mode, dialogue, and surgical, and you basically don't really need to adjust anything unless you have a ton of background noise, in which case you could then start adjusting your threshold and the reduction. But in general, 0 and around 12 is pretty good. So it's bypassed right now. We'll just play back these ideas, even though you think of them, and then turn it on. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. And maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself. There we go. So pretty much perfect there. Again, come down to this area. We'll just grab just this area. It's bypassed right now. Hear that? And turn it on. It's pretty much silence. Again, we could reduce it a little bit more, but we don't want to go crazy here. Yeah, we don't want to pull this way up here because then it's just going to sound kind of odd. So that's pretty good there. And it's important to actually clean your audio before you start putting compression on it and raising all those levels, which is why we have it above Nectar 3 here. Okay. We could also turn on our declick. That's on now. And these ideas, even though you think of them much, much better. And let's head in here to Nectar 3 and start shaping our audio. I'm going to turn off all the modules that are on right now. Now, you don't have to use a gate if you don't want to. What a gate is going to do, it's going to bring down that audio in sort of these lower level places. Okay, as you'll see here, I'll just grab this area. And every time our playhead gets to these areas, you're going to see the gate kick in. Ideas, even though you think of them as you can see, it's shutting that down. Okay, so to set my gate first, I'm going to find an area that I don't want there to be much audio in, like right here. I'll just play it back, and you can see on the trace here that level of the audio. If I pull it down here, you're hearing it, right? Just going to pull it up. I'm going to adjust my ratio. I'm not going to go crazy with the ratio. I just want to shut it down some. You can see even over here, it's getting shut down. If it was bypassed, you can see that level right there. So we're just lowering that level, okay? So again, not going crazy here, just somewhere around there. And my attack, I'm going to do sort of a high attack time, 4 milliseconds or so. And I want to hold on to it for a while. I don't want it coming on and then, going off. So that's essentially how you can set your gate pretty quick here in Nectar 3. So that's pretty good for us. Again, we don't have to use one, especially since we have RX7 voice denoise here, because this audio is not really that annoying once we have cleaned it. So let me get rid of the gate. So there's not really much there anyway, but I'm just going to have this on again to pull down those levels in these spaces where there's not really much going on, to get rid of sort of those errant breath sounds and things like that. So there's our gate all set up and ready to go. Let me squeeze this down a little bit and we'll play back these ideas. So right there, we have a lot of S sounds. Let me turn the de-esser off so you can really hear that. These ideas. So those S's are really coming through. So turn on your de-esser. I'm going to find the range that I want to affect and then the threshold. So let me just play back sort of this area here. These ideas. Let's go to listen mode here. And these ideas. These ideas. So that's pretty good right there for our range, but of course our threshold is way too low. These ideas. We're not trying to kill our S's. We just want to tame them, right? So let's pull this up here and then we'll bring it down. These ideas. Even though you think of them, these ideas. Even though you think of them, these ideas. All right, so for your range here, somewhere between 25 or 2.5 up to maybe 6 or so. It just sort of depends on where those S's are really living for you. I'm going to put it up here in this case around 5.1, I think. These ideas, even though you think of them, these ideas, even though you... All right, I'm pretty good with that. We could take it down a little bit more. These ideas, even though you think of them, these ideas. All right, pretty happy with that. Again, just play around with it. It's not too hard to dial in your de-esser here in Nectar 3. Now, before we get to our EQ, I should probably mention that we have the ALM on. And what ALM does is it's the auto level mode. It's sort of like Wave's vocal writer, sort of. It's not exactly the same thing. But what it does is it pulls up our levels of our raw audio track before it's going through any of these processes So everything is a bit more even. It's kind of like compression, but it's not the same thing as compression. It actually makes compression work better because everything is more even before it actually hits the compressor. So I have this on, just, turn it on. And I'm not going crazy with my levels here, just around, 5.5 or so. It's pretty good for my purposes. You may want to pull it down to around 10, just depends on what you're doing. But for a YouTube video or a podcast, I'd put it around maybe 5 or so. Give ourselves some room. If I had it off and we listen, these ideas, even though you think of them as something your brains create, right? So it's just pulling up and even down that audio to keep it around this level right here. And I also have a limiter on, and in this case, this limiter is just placing a cap. So it's not increasing the audio as we pull this down, as you see in other limiters. These ideas, right? It's just capping it off. You think of them as something your brain's creating. So I'm going to give myself about a dB or so. That's pretty good. Just so I'm not clipping, or, on some systems, if it goes above that sort of -1 dB, you might get some weird artifacts. So I'm going to set that right there. All right, let's get back to our EQ here. Now I already have it set up. We're going to adjust some things a bit. And as I said, this is sort of the settings I prefer, not the Joe Rogan sound. If you want the Joe Rogan sound, again, go watch that video. It will be in the description below. The EQ will be set up quite a bit differently. So let's head into here and see exactly what we're doing. We start with it off again. These ideas, okay, turn it on. These ideas, even though you think of them much clearer, much more present, and not quite as boomy. So what we're doing here, let's start at the low end, is we're using a high pass, and we're using a 12 dB per octave slope here. And I'm really going to come up here and say cut out maybe up to 75. It really just depends on what you want. I don't mind a lot of low end, so I usually set it around 50-ish to 60-ish, but you can mess around with this. What your high pass is going to do, these ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself. So if you're going for that podcast sound, you might want to take it up to say 100 or so. But I don't mind that low end for YouTube videos or for podcasts. I actually like leaving some of that low end in there because it makes the voice more natural and a bit more full, in my opinion. So for us, let's just set this around, say 65. I think that sounds pretty good there. These ideas. So let's move on to our second band here. Now this is optional. I'm pulling in a bit of somewhere around 150-ish to 200 or so, just a bit. These ideas. This area right here. Just makes it a little bit wider overall. I'm using a bell shape for that. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating, right? Makes it a little bit more full. Now, I'm not going to do it a ton, just a bit, just a dB, maybe 2 or so. Sort of just depends. Now, for our next band, I'm actually pulling some out because this area gets a bit boxy to me. These ideas, even though you think of them, right, as that's kind of boxy. So I'm going to pull some of that out. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's create, it immediately opens up and clears up once we sort of make room for the rest of these frequencies here. So this area here between 250 and even up to 750 can get kind of boxy. Really just depends on your voice and the room that you're in. These ideas, even though you think of them as, there we go. So this band here, again, I'm pulling out a bit, around 400 in this case. These ideas, for the same reason, it's just kind of boxy for me. These ideas, that's better. For this one here, same thing. These ideas, sort of a weird, these ideas, boxiness to that. Not going to pull out a ton here, just a bit. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. So that's much, much better. Then up here, there is a harshness. These ideas, even though you think of them. Now, I don't like that. I could try to leave it flat. These ideas, but it gets a little bit too harsh in my opinion. So up here in our upper mids, a little bit above 2000 hertz, I'm going to pull down just a bit, but I'm actually going to make this a dynamic EQ based on gain and we're going to have it going down. Okay. And just adjust our threshold here. These ideas, I pull it all the way here, even though you think of them, you see it's not pulling any down. So I'll just adjust this. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. So that way we're not pulling that frequency range out all the time. We're just pulling it out whenever it gets above that threshold, and then it gets pulled down, right? I could even take it up here if you wanted to boost it a bit and then pull it down. You can do that as well. These ideas, but that's too much for us. I need to have this band down here, maybe about minus 3.3. And this is going to be a little bit different for you. You're really going to have to just sort of create your nodes here and then do sort of the pan and scan or the boost and twist or the boost and sweep method here. These ideas, even though you think of them where you find those frequencies that way with your bell shape and a tight bell, and then you can carve that out however you want. All right. So I know this band for me needs to be cut out a little bit more. Let's pull it down. These ideas, much better. Even though you think of them. Now for your top end, this sort of depends on how much clarity you want and how much balance you want. So for me, I don't want to go crazy with this. It can sound good really boosting this up. Now I'm using an analog high shelf with a really wide shape. So we're pulling up, a wide area here. If I had it like this, you'll really see that shelf shape, but I want it nice and wide here. So we're pulling up a lot of that content. So if I start with it down here, we're around 6,000 to 7,000 or so. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating. Now that can sound good if you like it. I like it a little bit more balanced myself. I don't mind it being down here. Now I wouldn't want to cut it out. These ideas, even though you think of them, it's way too dark, right? So again, you're going to have to mess around with this for your voice and see what sounds best for you. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it. So I think that sounds pretty good for this here. And then our EQ is basically done. And now we'll move on to our compressor, which of course is going to control our dynamic range. And down here is a compressed track of the same exact audio file. You can see that our peaks are way up here. And we have a bunch of low information, lower levels down here. Whereas once you compress that, everything is much more even. So that way, if you talk loudly and then you start talking softer, the volume difference isn't as apparent, and your listener isn't going to have to be writing their volume all the time, because sometimes somebody laughs loud and then they sort of whisper into the microphone, right? So that's what compression is going to do for us, as you can see in this file here versus the natural up here. So let's get on to compression. This is pretty simple here in Nectar 3. Now I'm going to use a digital compressor for my first compressor because digital is very clean and transparent, and it's not going to add a bunch of, color or anything like that. So just play back. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, you can see how it's pulling down those peaks, dependent upon, of course, our ratio and our threshold here. So for this, I'm going to take it down, I don't know, maybe minus 12 or so. These ideas, even though you think of them, I'm not trying to squash this, These ideas. Now keep in mind, I do have makeup gain, or the auto makeup gain applied right there as well. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, right? So that auto makeup gain is going to sort of automatically adjust that amount of gain supplied or applied. And then we have our makeup knob right here as well. So I usually leave this on because it gives me a better idea of what my audio actually sounds like, right? These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses, that's pretty good. I'm gonna come back to my EQ. That's a little too high for me. That's probably better. These ideas. So for my ratio, I'm going to go about 4 to 1 or so. Then my attack, you can sort of play with this. This is how quickly that compression basically kicks in. So around 3 or 4 is good to start. Then you can just sort of mess around there. My release, I like to hold on kind of long because I don't want it pumping, and I don't mind having that compression hold on for a pretty long time. You could take this up to 100 and something milliseconds if you want, but we'll just put it on around 70. These ideas, even though you think of them okay. And then you apply your makeup gain. Now we already have the automatic level here, but we're going to drive this a bit harder in our case with our makeup gain here as well. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. Okay, so that's pretty good right there. Again, mess around a bit with your threshold. If you just want to tame the peaks, pull it up here. If you want to squash it a bit more, pull it down a bit. It's going to level things out a bit more for you. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself much better. Okay, so that's pretty good there. And then for your second compressor here, in this case, I'm going to use a vintage model, as I usually do, because that gives it sort of that tube warmth and makes it a little bit thicker overall, okay? Again, we have our auto makeup gain on this already. These ideas, even though you think of them, and for our second compressor, I'm really just getting those peaks again. These ideas, even though you think of them, as you can see right there in the trace, we're just pulling it down a little bit more to make it a little bit more even overall. Same thing, essentially for our ratio, around 3 in this case. I'm not going to really compress it that much. Attack, about 5 in this case. Release, pretty long, 50 milliseconds. And then just adjust our makeup gain here for our essentially overall level that you might want to drive into the limiter. Now, I don't want to take this all the way up, right? Listen to this. These ideas, even though you think of them as, you can see that limiter is really kicking in there, and it doesn't sound natural at all, right? Everything is way too compressed at that point. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it so that it can manifest itself in the real world. There we go. So we pretty much have it right here. Again, our compressor 2, compressor 1, which I might mess around with a bit, squash it a little bit more here. These ideas. So for this first compressor, I'm doing most of my compression there. And then again, for the second one, we're just taming those peaks, just a little bit more. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. Okay, now again, you may not want to go this loud, but on YouTube, a lot of things are pretty loud and you sort of have to compete with those levels. If you wanted things to sound a bit more natural, you would actually pull your makeup gain down here and down here. And it sounds, it still sounds pretty good. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it to compete with our levels here. I'm going to jack this up. In my case, about 2 or 3 dB here and about another dB here. And I'm going to pull this up just a bit, just to pull it up. These ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating. And there we go. So our finished track, these ideas, even though you think of them as something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it. Back on. As something your brain's creating, and maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it uses your brain to create it. All right, much better. And of course, here in Nectar 3, once you set up your preset, head up here to your presets, okay? And just hit plus, and we'll call this SM7B, say YouTube voice or podcast voice or whatever you want. Press enter, and now you have that preset right here. So anytime you set up your SM7B, you're ready to make your next YouTube video or podcast, you have your preset right here. Just select it and you're all set up and ready to go. You can of course make multiples. So here's one I made in a previous video, right? So if I want that Joe Rogan podcast sound, I can pull it up real quick as something your brain's creating. And maybe your brain is creating it. So there's our Joe Rogan sound, and go right back to the sound I prefer, which is much closer to this here. I might cut a little more low end out, as something your brain's creating. And maybe your brain is creating it, but maybe it, all right. So that is using Nectar 3 to get that pro sound with your Shure SM7B.